Mr. Noble here. If you are watching this, then you have picked the direct instruction portion of this week's lesson. Before we begin, I just want to say I hope you guys are doing well. I always miss you. Some of you guys have been reaching out. I've been getting some emails, which has been really cool. Also, we've been doing this thing that I think is really fun. We do Zoom meetings that are optional. We've been doing them every week, but lately I've been doing stuff that has leads to this academic conversation where we look at certain elements of the period we're studying in history and how it relates to our world today. So this week we're studying the Great Depression, and we talked about how what we're going through now is a little different than the Great Depression and some of the ways that it's the same. A lot of it has to do with New Deal policies that help pull America out of the Depression, and we're going to get into that next week. So come on in. I mean, it's 30 minutes and it's a lot of fun. So I really hope you guys show up. Without any further ado, today we talk about the Great Depression. In the background here is a photograph known as Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange, which is a famous photo. I'm sure you'll see it many times in your life. It is of a migrant woman with her children who has presumably lost her home in the Great Depression. So what happened? We're going to talk about what caused the Great Depression. Now, the stock market crash of 1929 was a main factor, but it wasn't the only factor. What also happened was bank failures, an ecological disaster known as the Dust Bowl, rapid rise in unemployment, and poor economic policy to try and handle the Great Depression. We're going to look at each of these individually today. In the background in this photo, you can see actually a group of businessmen waiting in line to receive soup. So this is like a event that shaped American history, and it shaped the lives of those people who lived it. My grandma in particular talks to me about the Great Depression as sort of this unparalleled time of need in American history, and that really shaped people's whole outlook on life. I think the reason that she always buys so much food when she goes to the grocery store is because of the insecurity that she experienced during the Great Depression. So let's look a little bit at why banks failed in 1929. A couple factors contributed to the failures of banks. Now, bank failures turned what would have been a major recession into the Great Depression. If the banks hadn't failed, it probably just would have been a recession. Thinking back to 2008, when the federal government bailed out Bank of America and all those banks that had been making those really lousy home loans, this is because they did that because of this. They looked at what happened when banks failed in 1929 and in the decade that followed, and they realized that the American people can't go through that again. So a couple things contributed to this. The first is banks that were not a part of the Federal Reserve System kept policies that invited disaster. The Federal Reserve System had really only started to become popular in 1914, and before that, and also the banks that existed outside of the system after it, had these policies that weren't super well regulated. One of them was this practice that would lead to artificially high valuation of assets in the bank. So actually, like when someone would cash a check, the bank would count that money before they received it. And in turn, the bank that the check was drawn from would also count the money until it was withdrawn. So you have one check getting counted twice, and this is happening over the outside of that across all of the banking system outside of the Federal Reserve System. So bad policies. Now, banks lost a lot of money in the stock market crash, and they often had assets invested in that they lost value. For instance, banks tend to invest in real estate. It's a pretty safe investment. And when the stock market crashed, the value of real estate plummeted as well. So banks lost money that they had invested. And when all of this happened, people made these things called bank runs. So they rushed to banks because they had heard that banks were probably going to fail, and they wanted to get their money out before the banks failed. And that in turn actually made more banks fail because banks don't typically keep all of the money they have on hand. That's just not a thing that banks do. What banks do is you give banks your money, and then they, with the trust that you can get it whenever you want, and in turn they take that money and they invest it for a profit. That's how banking works. And banks just aren't equipped to handle that kind of mass rush to withdraw funds. And what happened was banks failed. And when a bank fails, all of the assets of the bank start to disappear. And so if you were one of those people who made a bank run and you didn't get your money, say you had saved every day for your entire life and you'd saved up $20,000, a lot of money in 1929, but you're in line and all of a sudden the bank fails. That $20,000 is gone. Any hope you have of ever seeing it again is gone. And, I hear stories of people who lost trust in banks so much when this happened that they never regained it. And it's not uncommon to see people who lived through the Great Depression who sort of hide money around their houses because if the bank fails, they want to have some way of surviving. I mean, this isn't people's trust in most basic institutions is shaken when a bank starts to fail. And by the end of the decade, over 9,000 banks had done that. Now, what happens when banks fail? What happens when the stock market crashes? People lose their money and people lose their jobs. So when the stock market crashed in 1929, businesses across the country had to slow production or close their doors. If there's less demand on the market and you run a factory, you have to produce less output. So you have to cut costs. And one way you cut costs is to lay people off. Now, massive layoffs happened as a result of this. At one point, unemployment rose to 25%. That's a quarter of all Americans were idle. And when workers are laid off, they're unable to pay their bills, they're unable to pay their mortgages. And also, sort of the technological advancements and boom times of the 1920s had introduced the ability to consumers to buy things on credit. Remember, we talked a little bit about radios and how popular they were. Well, a lot of people bought radios on credit, but when they lost their jobs, you're not going to pay off the radio when you're trying to feed your family. And so they sunk deeper into debt. And in a lot of instances, people had to sell off all of their furniture, all of their belongings in order to try and make that next mortgage payment. And many, many Americans ended up losing their homes as a result of unemployment that happened after the stock market crashed. Now, a lot of people who were unemployed and destitute traveled the country in search of a better future. Some of those migrants famously rode freight trains. This is what we think of when we talk about the hobo, the man who rides the rails. Like sitting in a boxcar with like a hat with holes in it. And they're always wearing suits in culture. Those guys. When really what they were is it's actually much sadder. Is they were people who had lost everything and were just kind of traveling around looking for work. And you have vast numbers of people traveling the country who have lost everything. And that's really the source of the hobo. And now people who had lost their homes tended to flock and make shanty towns that became known as Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover. But we're going to talk more about Hoovervilles in a minute. So on top of all of that, we have the Dust Bowl. Now, I want to talk about the Dust Bowl because it's a particular ecological phenomenon that is little understood by lay people. Like if you ask people what the Dust Bowl is, or even what the term meant, they're going to be pretty confused. They're going to say it was really dusty for a while. People lost their farms. Now, those are true, but first off, let's talk about the name Dust Bowl. So the term Dust Bowl refers to actually a area of the country that was afflicted with this ecological disaster of drought. And the area is the high plains. And if you look at it from a map, it's like a circle. It looks like a bowl. So that's where the term Dust Bowl comes from. Now, Kansas and Oklahoma were settled during a relatively wet period in that region's history. That region is called the High Plains. And also, sort of the increase in American output of goods, especially like foodstuffs like wheat, made the High Plains appear to be a really great investment for settlers. And to make matters more complicated, real estate brokers who were selling portions of land and people who wanted, from the US government, who wanted those areas settled, sort of artificially increased they lied. They lied about how much rain the region got. And that really led people to think that they were investing in a pretty safe bet going and homesteading in the High Plains. They said there are government studies that said that the area was at little risk of drought and would probably be agriculturally viable for the future. And settlers did what they thought they should do, which was farmed wheat heavily and using a lot of new equipment, combines, harvesters. They destroyed the natural grasslands that shielded the soil from erosion. And so what had happened is this grass had grown across the High Plains over a millennia. And grass is a rhizome, which means that underneath the plant that you see is an interconnected latticework of root systems. Those root systems are really good at proliferating new plants, and they're also really good at storing moisture, and also root systems in general, they really do a good job at holding soil in place. Now, if you take away the grasslands, it's going to seem okay for a while, but eventually the wet period dries up. And what happens is, without the grasslands to shield the soil from erosion, you have massive erosion. And what happens is these huge clouds of dust kick up that reportedly cross the entire country. People talk about seeing dust storms in New York during the Dust Bowl. Those farms that people had rushed out and made quick riches off of really farming super hard, those people lost their farms. Farms, disappeared in a second, just as quick as a bank fails. And the farms are rendered useless, and the owners of those farms lose their farms to the bank and have to travel across the country in search of work. A lot of them travel to California and were referred to as Okies. Okie also is sort of become pejorative or insulting slang for a stupid person. When you say, look at that Okie over there, it's a really outdated way of calling someone stupid. People scapegoated jackrabbits and had what were called jackrabbit drives, where they believed it was actually the jackrabbits that caused the Dust Bowl. Because in a time of crisis, people always look for a scapegoat, which leads us. Oh, there's a picture of what it looked like, which is crazy. When people look for a scapegoat, they look usually at the person in charge. And thinking about the poor economic policy that helped keep America in the Great Depression, it's really insightful to look at President Herbert Hoover. He does get an unfair rap in history, although his conservative individualist policies did help protract the period of the Great Depression. Another thing to think of is the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which sharply increased taxes on imported goods to the United States, and the idea that people would purchase domestically. This is an idea people talk about today. Obviously, that didn't work, and it hurt trade overall. Hoover's initial attempts to right the economy were piecemeal and state-oriented. They weren't these massive, big programs. Now, the newly homeless lived in Hoovervilles, right? They scapegoated Hoover. And really what happened was Hoover had these ideas for programs that became essential parts of the policy that righted the Great Depression, but he wasn't willing to do the massive all-in approach. And this guy was. So I'll see you next week for a new deal. Have a great week, and thank you for watching.